I think we have a wonderful opportunity to prepare for the Valletta Conference and to focus on particular issues, particularly issues relating to the problems and suffering which many Eritreans continue to endure. Human rights violations, relentless cruelty, tyranny and oppression are tragically everyday experiences for Eritreans. It's horrifying. It is also so far away from what so many Eritreans heroically fought for and what campaigners outside that country were supporting in the struggle they made for liberation. 27 years ago, in March 1988, I travelled to Eritrea with a War on Want team, which many of you will be aware of War on Want, to look at water projects and to assess other ways of developing partnership and support with Eritreans. I've also been there twice since in delegations from the European Parliament, when I, of course, was an MEP myself. In 1988, in the midst of conflict, incessant Ethiopian air attacks meant that we could only travel at night, and the devastating effect of the 27-year war between Eritrea and Ethiopia were painfully plain. At the hospital in Orota, on the night after the Battle of Alphabet, we saw men and women fighters of the EPLF army with the most terrible, terrible battlefield injuries. And we also witnessed the bravery, the skill and the inventiveness of the people of Eritrea. This and other experiences at that time made me even more determined to continue to show practical solidarity with the Eritreans who were demonstrating the indomitable spirit which had for years enabled them to fight poverty, famine and armed Ethiopian aggression. When I returned to Britain, I wrote a book in which I expressed great admiration for the people, for organisations like the National Union of Eritrean Women and for the EPLF leader, Isaias Afwerki. When Eritrea finally won independence and the victorious forces rode into Asmara in 1993, we rejoiced at what we and countless Eritreans thought was the beginning of a future of freedom. We were so wrong. 20 years later, Eritrea is now being described as Africa's North Korea, and the cruelty which is inflicted on Eritrean people by the Afwerki regime certainly justifies that description. The National Assembly hasn't met since 2002. The 1997 Constitution has never been implemented. There is no independent judiciary. Extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention of journalists, teachers and members of religious groups are very common. Eritreans are not allowed to move, speak, assemble or organise freely. Indefinite, compulsory military conscription and forced labour continues to prevail. The recent UN Commission report calls such conditions slavery and said, and I quote, "Some of the gross and widespread human rights abuses which are being committed in Eritrea under the authority of the government often constitute crimes against humanity." A member of that UN Commission of Inquiry said, "We seldom see human rights violations of the scope and scale as we see in Eritrea today." The list of atrocities goes on. Women face discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence and are being denied access to justice. Few, if any, detainees are brought to trial. Disappearances are commonplace. According to Human Rights Watch, prisoners are held in crowded underground cells or in shipping containers with no space even to lie down. The regime in Eritrea is, in short, a secretive, reclusive, authoritarian tyranny which is ruthlessly controlled by President Afwerki. His rule of terror, because that's what it is a complete betrayal of the cause of liberation and self-determination which so many Eritreans fought for and died for. That is why such large numbers of Eritreans are prepared to risk everything including the shoot-to-kill system operated in border areas, to escape their country to seek a better life for themselves and for their families. The scale of that exodus is huge. In 2014, almost as many men, women and children fled from Eritrea, a country incidentally of 6 million people which are not at war, as fled in that year from Syria, a country of 18 million people torn by 4 years of war. Clearly, a very large proportion of the people who cross land and sea in the desperate effort to reach Europe are in fact Eritreans. And they are unquestionably refugees under every definition of that pitiful status. All the evidence of the horror is in the UN Commission report and in the testimonies of the Eritreans. There is no need and no room for anyone to doubt these facts. What is needed now is decisive action and a clear and unequivocal policy on maintaining and fully enforcing UN sanctions against that Eritrean regime. The UN Commission urges us to offer protection to Eritrean asylum seekers. Knowing that in Britain and the European Union we must surely uphold the principle of providing refuge to people who have a genuine and justified fear of persecution and are fleeing from what manifestly constitutes crimes against humanity. There can be no good reason to say that giving refuge will simply encourage more to take awful risks, something we've all heard. Living in Eritrea is in itself an awful, awful risk. Thinking about leaving is an awful risk. Doing it is an awful risk. It isn't the prospect of refuge that makes people flee. It is the dread of staying which makes them abandon their homeland. Eritrea is isolated politically, regionally and internationally, and UN sanctions are very firmly in place. We are hearing now, however, some suggestions that substantial financial aid should be given to Eritrea as part of efforts being made to stem the exodus of refugees. Such a course, if it was ever taken, would be disastrous, not least because on the basis of all the evidence about the regime, any EU aid offered to Eritrea would be seen as an endorsement of the government and used to entrench a repressive regime, not to help those in need. It would also certainly breach the EU's commitment, which states, a very strong and important commitment, human rights is at the forefront of EU development cooperation. We need clarity on that and other concerns which have been raised, and I very much hope that in your discussions all of these issues will be discussed and raised. Nothing can obscure the fact that Eritreans bear being terrorised and trapped into what amounts to enslavement by a regime that imposes tyranny, cruelty and continuing terrible oppression. Nothing should diminish the reality that Eritrean victims of that persecution deserve all our solidarity, and they need to be supported by all of us who believe that conciliation and concession to regimes such as exist in Eritrea will surely fail. No such softening should ever be contemplated. Our own freedom compels us to fulfill our duty to those who are not free, and never will be until the vileness that imprisons Eritrea is ended once and for all.